This outline will be an overview of imperialism. The outline is adapted from Western civilizations W. Norton Publishers. First, it will be helpful to give some form of definitions. A. The process of extending one state's control over another. This can take the form of a formal imperialism, or C, informal imperialism. Under formal, it would be colonial or direct control. 2, annexation of territory. Or 3, establishing new governments. Under informal imperialism, 1, we have conquering nations. 2, reaching agreements with indigenous leaders and governing through them. Reaching agreements with indigenous or native leaders and governing through them. Part 2. Allowing a weaker state to maintain independence while governing through them. Or 3, carving out zones of European sovereignty and privilege. For slide 2, we will talk about imperialist endeavors. A. From 1875 to 1902, Europeans took 90% of Africa. Between 1870 and 1900, a small group of Europeans colonized 1/4 of the world's land. Part 3, 18th century losses. A, the British in the North American colonies. B, the French Atlantic trade. And C, Spanish and Portuguese in South America. Part 4. 19th century imperialism. This appeared A, against the backdrop of industrialization, liberal revolutions, and the rise of nation states. There was a large need for raw materials, a sense of bringing progress to the world. The imperialists thought to distance themselves from earlier histories of conquest. Colonial resistance and rebellion forced Europeans to develop new strategies of rule. Colonial resistance and rebellion led to new strategies to rule. Carefully codified racial, ethnic hierarchies. In part 5, I'm going to talk about the new imperialism and its causes. In part A, we will talk about the economic arguments. First, we will have J.A. Hobson. He lived from 1858 to 1940. His important work was titled Imperialism. It was written in 1902. He argued that imperialism was driven by a small group of financiers. Included international capitalist, investors sought secure opportunities in the colonies. And he is also known for coining the term scramble for Africa. The text reads this way. The scope, intensity, and long-range consequences of the so-called new imperialism of the late 19th century have generated a heated debate about its causes. One influential group of critics and historians has argued that the causes were predominantly, if not exclusively, economic. As early as 1902, the English social reformer and theorist J. Hobson charged that what he called the scramble for Africa had occurred as a result of the economic interests of a small group of extremely rich and influential financiers throughout Western Europe. Hobson declared that the colonization of Africa had produced little economic gain for the taxpayers whose countries had dispatched armies of conquest and occupation at the behest of international capitalists. Profits went only to the rich who ventured beyond the bounds of economically stagnant Western Europe in search of a higher return on their investments than could be realized at home. Hobson concluded that the late 19th century imperialism was a depraved choice of national life, appealing primarily to the lusts of self-seeking acquisitiveness and forceful domination. Again from the text, Hobson's analysis inspired a more influential critique of imperialism by the Russian communist and future revolutionary leader, N. Lenin. Lenin's work is entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Lenin argued that A, imperialism was an essential stage in the development of capitalism. An essential stage in the development of capitalism. B, the internal contradictions of capitalism produced imperialism. Again, the internal contradictions of capitalism produced imperialism. And finally, C, the overthrow of capitalism would check or stop imperialism. In part B, we will talk about the strategic and national motives. In part B, we'll talk about the strategic and national motives. Part 1, international rivalries fueled the belief that national interests were at stake. Again, that's international rivalries fueled the belief that national interests were at stake. 2, the French supported imperialism as a way of restoring national honor. Again, 2, the French supported imperialism as a way of restoring national honor. 3, the British worried about German and French industrialization and losing world markets. The British worried about French and German industrialization and losing markets. And finally here, 4, there's an important link between imperialism and nation building. In part C, we will talk about the cultural dimension. I'm going to do a quick excerpt from the book here, page 832. Imperialism must also be understood as something more than official policy, whether carefully conceived or accidental. A French diplomat once described the dynamic English imperial adventurer, Cecil Rhodes, as a force cast in an idea. The same might be said of imperialism itself. Imperialism as an idea excited the minds of explorers like English missionary David Livingstone, who believed that his country's conquest of Africa would put an end to the East African slave trade and introduce the Negro family into the body of corporate nations. Rudyard Kipling, the English poet and novelist, wrote of the white man's burden, of his mission to civilize half-devil, half-child races that inhabited what most Europeans considered barbaric and heathen quarters of the globe. To combat slave trading, famine, filth, and illiteracy seemed to many a legitimate reason for invading the jungles of Africa and Asia. So again, in the cultural dimension, we're going to talk about David Livingstone. (1813 to 1873), and his attempt to end slave trade, or his hope, more accurately. 2, we can talk about Rudyard Kipling, 1865 to 1936, 1865 to 1936, and his white man's burden, which is often very much misconstrued and under a great bit of contradiction. Both of these ideas kind of belay number 3, or support number 3, the idea that many Europeans had at civilizing the barbaric and heathens.